Good evening and welcome everybody. I'm Mark Pennington, the Director of the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society, which is hosting the lecture this evening. This event is part of our ongoing series on the political economy of knowledge and ignorance. The series examines issues of complexity and uncertainty. By that, we refer to situations where decisions made in one part of a complex system or order may have consequences that cannot be anticipated by actors in other parts of that system or order. We're sponsoring work that explores the governance implications of situations where agents do not have full information about other actors in a system and where they cannot simply acquire the necessary data by searching for more of it. These scenarios raise serious challenges for the structure of governance institutions in multiple domains, from finance to public health, to international relations, and to the management of ecological systems. Now, one set of ideas for improving decision-making in these settings is the suggestion that new algorithmic techniques might help us to ameliorate problems of constrained rationality and uncertainty. And it's in that context that I'm delighted and truly honoured to introduce this evening's lecture and our speaker, Professor Cass Sunstein. Professor Sunstein is Robert Walmsley Professor at Harvard University, where he's the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. He's the recipient of numerous awards and prizes, including in 2020, the Holberg Prize from the Norwegian government, a law and humanities equivalent to the Nobel Prizes. He's occupied senior advisory positions with the Obama and Biden administrations in the United States, and he's an advisor to the UK government's Behavioural Insights Unit. In the context of this evening's lecture, I don't think anyone has done more in recent years to examine the implications of how we think about people and their governance institutions operating in conditions of constrained rationality. Indeed, Cass has written so many articles and books related to this topic that one might say there is a problem of informational overload in comprehending the scale of his contributions. To name but a few works just in the last 15 years, we have, of course, Nudge, written with Richard Thaler in 2008, Simpler, The Future of Government, 2013, The Ethics of Influence, 2015, The Cost-Benefit Revolution, 2018, On Freedom, 2019, How Change Happens, 2019, and Too Much Information, 2020. I'd like to thank Cass for taking the time out from what I know is a very busy schedule to address us this evening. I invite you all now to welcome him to speak to us about the use of algorithms in society. Please welcome Professor Cass Sunstein.
Well, thank you for coming. Thank you, Mark, for that very kind introduction. Did you notice that one of my books is called Too Much Information? Was that a retrospective observation about my excessive pages? Was that a kind of apology? Yes, I meant it a little bit that way. Okay, how's the audio? Can you hear me? Yeah, it's good. Okay, we're going to talk a fair bit about algorithms, but shall we start with people? Let's start with people. Human beings sometimes in our judgments make mistakes, have you noticed? And here are two sources of mistakes. Sometimes we are biased, and sometimes we are noisy. Think of a bias like a scale. This is actually like my scale, which is a little unkind, where every morning it shows me as somewhat heavier than I actually am. It is a systematically error-prone scale. It is a mean scale. I don't like my scale. It shows me as heavier than I actually am. That is a systematic bias, and sometimes we show biases in human judgments, where people might be too optimistic about the likelihood that the project they're now working on will get finished in the next month. That's bias. Noise is like a scale which is variable. It's not a cruel scale, it's a scale with a sense of humor and mischief. So a scale which shows you as a little heavier than you actually are on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and a little lighter than you actually are the rest of the week, that is a noisy scale. It is highly variable in its judgments. Notice, if you would, that a noisy scale might be on average right, but it is nonetheless telling you half the time something wrong and cheerful, and half the time telling you something wrong and disturbing. So our judgments are often biased, and our judgments are often noisy. In thinking about human judgment, you should think, I believe, that a bias is a charismatic kind of finding. A cognitive bias, I'm not talking about racial or gender bias, is something that is like Elvis Presley or Taylor Swift or Daisy Jones in Daisy Jones and the Six, which I hope you're watching. It's a very good show. Daisy Jones is charismatic, like, by the way, the actress's literal grandfather, who is Elvis Presley. If you can show that a bias accounts for an error, there's an aha in the mind. If you can show that noise accounts for the error, there's a little bit of a pause in the mind. Noise is like a character in a mystery whom you never notice until the last scene, who turns out to be the person who actually killed everyone. Noise is the uncharismatic source of human error. Okay, human beings, a tendency toward bias and a tendency toward noise. And here's Anais Nin. I bet you weren't expecting to hear Anais Nin. Here's Anais Nin. The possession of knowledge does not kill the sense of wonder and mystery. There is always more mystery. And that's going to be an upshot of these remarks. We're going to, in a way, march up a hill and then down a hill. This is our journey. Isn't it terrible when a lecturer refers to our journey as the content of his or her remarks? So let's not call it a journey. Our adventure, that's worse. It's not a journey or an adventure. These are the remarks and the theses of these sentences, which you're kind enough to hear. The first thesis is that in important domains, algorithms are fantastically good because they can overcome the harmful effects of cognitive biases, which have a strong hold not only on ordinary people dealing with our lives, but also experts dealing with things on which they've spent decades. So algorithms, hooray, can avoid bias and generally noise. That is, typically algorithms will give the same answer to the question, though you may have noticed that ChatGPT is a noisy algorithm as well as sometimes a biased algorithm. Okay, the technical word for what I'm about to say is awesome. That is, this is an awesome fact, which is not only can algorithms overcome biases, they can tell us what biases are producing human error. So amazingly, they can identify biases, some of which are new and haven't been named yet. Okay, that's up the hill. Down the hill is in a more Hayekian spirit. The second claim is actually consistent with the first, but it has a different valence. To get at it, let's just acknowledge that in the domains in which algorithms outperform human beings, and we're going to find some, they are significantly better. But they're not spectacularly better. They do better than we do across large populations, but they don't know what's going to happen in individual cases. An algorithm might tell you, for example, that across a large population, people who have characteristics X and Y and Z are going to end up with high probability in situations A, B, and C. But if you ask an algorithm whether this particular person in that situation is going to end up with that particular outcome, its judgment will be better than that of a human being, but only a little bit better. Across a large population, fantastic gains. In individual cases, small increases in probability of accuracy. Okay, that's a clue that algorithms aren't going to perform very well in the context to which I'm going to draw attention. Should we have a little fun and identify one of them? Algorithms aren't great at predicting whether there's going to be romantic attraction between two people. So if you get two people and tell an algorithm lots of stuff about their preferences and characteristics that are shown probabilistically to be correlated with them liking person X, Y, and Z and not liking certain other people, and then you ask the algorithm, are these two people going to like each other in a romantic way? They don't do very well. They do really not well. Why is that? I think we have a clue there about situations in which algorithms are challenged not only to outperform human beings who don't do well, but to do objectively well at all. So the suggestion is there's a set of cases in which algorithms have immense difficulty in solving prediction problems. And think of romantic sparks as an illustration. Okay, it is no surprise, I hope, that the second part of the claim in particular, the algorithms can't succeed part, is a play on Hayek's great essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society. So Hayek said, if you haven't committed his essay to heart, if we possess all of the relevant information, if we can start out from a given set of preferences, and if we can command complete knowledge of available means, the problem which remains is purely one of logic. But the knowledge of the circumstances of which we make use never exists in concentrated or integrated form, but solely as dispersed bits of incomplete and frequently contradictory knowledge which all the separate individuals possess. That's a mouthful. Think of a planner in a country. Think of a market in a country. The market, Hayek said, is a marvel because it will possess a ton of information that the planner, however amazing and however well motivated, just won't have. So if you're thinking about the right price of this pen, it's a pretty nice pen, a planner might say something, but the market will figure it out better because the market will know a ton of things. Okay, to a significant degree, I'm urging the limits of prediction cannot be overcome. They're built into the human conditions, and this is true for algorithms as well as for people. Let's to get a little bit out front, just note there's a modest version of the skeptical hypothesis, which is that algorithms can't now, but let's be a little reckless and adopt the bolder version of the thesis, which is algorithms can't ever. Okay? That's the potentially reckless, bolder version. Okay, now we're going to talk about what algorithms can do and how they can outperform people. And we're going to talk about two sets of data, one involving human judges who are supposed to be experts in the relevant matter, and the other involving doctors and heart disease who are supposed to be technocrats. And while these are recent data sets and findings, what's impressive about them is they mirror each other. They're basically the same sets of findings. So keep that in mind if you would. Imagine judges are trying to figure out, as the law requires, whether people should get bail. Judges, to figure out the answer to that question, have to answer a prediction problem. what's the likelihood that a defendant is going to flee the jurisdiction? So you have a person who did assault, let's say. The question is, can the person go home and be with his family and do some work, or does the person stay in jail pending trial? In many places, the question is, will the defendant flee? That's a prediction problem. In many others, the question is, will the defendant commit a crime? You don't want another assault in the midst of the period preceding trial. That would be very, very bad. As it turns out, flight risk and crime are closely correlated, so that if you accurately predict the first, you can accurately predict the second. Okay, here's the study by Kleinberg and collaborators. The same data available to judges at the time of the bail hearing, such as the current offense, the prior criminal history, etc., are made available to the algorithm. And the question for the algorithm, as for the judge, is should the person be denied bail? Now, you might be thinking that the human encounter between someone accused of shoplifting or assault and a human judge has a kind of nobility and humanity to it. To displace that by asking the algorithm to make the decision seems a little Black Mirror, doesn't it? Dark Mirror, Black Mirror, TV shows with scary titles. But here's the finding. Use of the algorithm could maintain the same detention rate now produced by human judges and reduce crime by up to 24.7%. We use the algorithm rather than the people. We keep the same number of people in prison, and the level of crime is reduced by up to 24.7%. That means there's a lot of crimes that don't happen because we use the algorithm. I hope you're wondering why, and we'll get to that, I promise, in a moment. Or suppose you thought, I want to get fewer people in prison. I want them to go home. You might think that noticing that a lot of the people who end up in prison are people of color. Maybe you want them to go home. Okay, you can keep the current level of crime and reduce jail rates by 41.9%. Massive decrease in the prison population. That means if you use algorithms instead of judges, you could get many thousands of people released pending trial without adding to the crime rate. Or you could prevent thousands of crimes without jailing even one additional person. It should be clear that use of the algorithm would allow any number of political choices about how to balance decreases in the crime rate against decreases in the detention rate. You can tell it what to do, and it will follow you. Okay, what do judges get wrong? We'll get to why in a moment. Judges release many people whom the algorithm says should not be released. Judges release almost half of the defendants judged by the algorithm to fall in the riskiest 1%. That's terrible. The algorithm says you're in the top 1% of the crime or flee, and the judge releases half of those people. Those people are rearrested at a rate of 62.7%. Judges show leniency to a population that's likely to commit crimes. Some judges are really strict in the sense that they're especially reluctant to allow bail, but their strictness is not limited to the riskiest defendants. The judges who are strict aren't releasing a lot of people who should be released. It's also the case that the system of judges is noisy. So across judges, there's a lot of variability in the system, which is unfair, and like the mischievous scale, leads to error. Okay, why do judges do worse than algorithms? Okay, here's something that shouts out from the data. It's almost like a cry for help on the part of judges hoping for algorithm therapy. Not quite that, but it is a shout from the data. There's a bias It's current offense bias. This is what I'm going to call it. The first mistake that current offense bias leads to is judges treat high-risk defendants as if they're low risk when their current charge is relatively minor. Example, someone commits shoplifting, but their background suggests they're going to do very bad things if they're released. The judges give a lot of weight to the fact that the current offense is shoplifting. Second, judges treat low-risk people as high risk when their current offense is pretty serious. Assault defendant, without much of a background, the algorithm might say, that person had a bad day. Go home, be with your family. The judge will say, assault, stay in prison. You did something terrible. The algorithm gives the current charge something closer to its appropriate weight. The fact that judges release a large number of high-risk defendants is attributable in large part to overweighting the current charge. Okay, I think current offense bias, as we're calling it, is pretty intuitive and it screams out from the data. But it doesn't account for all of the difference between the algorithm and people, in fact, not close. So here's where things get exciting. And this is Sherlock Holmes 2022, 2023 style. Can we do some detective work to ask the algorithm why it disagrees with the judges? The algorithm maybe can tell us. Work was done with the algorithm to ask, is there something about race or gender that explains it? No. Is there something about age that explains it? No. Is it about employment history or current employment status? No. The algorithm tells you the mugshot matters. To the judge. The judges really care about the mugshot. Okay, now we know that. Is it that male faces are more threatening than female faces? Is that people of color, the judges like less the mugshot than white people? Not really. Here's what comes out of the data. The algorithm doesn't care much or at all if people have a clean, well-kempt face or not. The judge really cares about that. If a person's face is very messy, hair all over the place, no comb, maybe a messy beard and such, holding everything else constant, race and gender are either zero or modest contributors, the judge is going to weight that. Okay, here's what's kind of eerie about current offense bias and mugshot bias. One of the earliest findings of human biases in judgment, I bet you know it, is availability bias, where if an event occurs in the recent past and is cognitively available, we will overweight the probability that it will occur again and underweight it if it isn't. Availability heuristic, availability bias. Current offense bias is either a close cousin to or just is availability bias. It's replicated in a context of high stakes with large numbers. Another bias in the early work on biases is called representativeness bias. If you see, coming from the representativeness heuristic, if you see someone walking down the street at night who, let's say, is a youngish man dressed in a way that suggests, let's say, aggressiveness, you might cross the street because that person is representative of, you shouldn't cross the street, but this can lead to terrible mistakes. Mugshot bias just is the representativeness heuristic. It's the same thing in the context of expert human judges. Okay, less bias, less noise. Now shall we talk about doctors? Let's suppose you are feeling chest pains and you go to the doctor and ask, should I be tested to see if I had a coronary event? Let's call it a heart attack to keep it simple. Would you be amazed to hear at this point that doctors perform less well than algorithms in deciding to test people for chest pains? And here are the two things that happen with doctors' poor performance compared to algorithms. First, the doctors will test a lot of people who shouldn't have to be tested. They should just go home and relax and maybe take something for, forgive the word, gas pains. But they're tested, which is time-consuming, expensive, and not fun. Also, doctors don't test a lot of people who should be tested, who end up in non-trivial health trouble because their doctor didn't test them for a heart attack. It's formally exactly parallel to the judge's finding, where you can maximize along the axis of trying to protect health, rely on the algorithm, do as many tests, save lives, or maximizing along the dimension of saving money, save as many people, do many more tests, and you can mix and match as well as you like. Okay, fast forward if you would to ask, why do the doctors do less well? There are two biases that doctors show that algorithms don't show. The first is current symptom bias. If someone comes in with something that really looks like a heart attack, doctors will give it a ton of weight, which isn't dumb, but more weight than the algorithm will. So let's say 22-year-old woman comes in, chest pains, doctor's more likely to test than the algorithm. We'll say 22-year-old woman, the likelihood it's a heart attack is really not high. The other thing that doctors do less well than the algorithm is they pay a lot of attention to demographics. They will over-test older people relative to their actual risks. Notice once more that we have cousins of the old-time, should we say old-timey, of the old-timey heuristics, availability and representativeness. Current symptoms bias equals current offense bias equals the availability heuristic. Demographic bias equals the representativeness heuristic equals mugshot bias. They're analytically the same thing. So we now have a sense of some of the promise of algorithms. They can overcome human biases, and more fascinatingly, I think, they can help identify human biases. They can show us the biases we fall prey to. Okay, here are some kind of, let's have two fun footnotes. Footnote number one, is that an oxymoron? There's no such thing as a fun footnote. Two not irrelevant footnotes. Two belong in the presentation footnotes. Okay, number one, with respect to testing people for heart attacks and flight risk, across large populations, the algorithm crushes the people. But in particular cases, the algorithm isn't amazing. So you get an increase in the probability that the person actually has had a heart attack if you use the algorithm, increase in the probability that the person's going to flee if you rely on the algorithm, but it's an increase in the probability. It's not like individual cases are nailed. So the improvement, while significant across a population, is really impressive. It's not like the old Tom Cruise movie about precognition. None of us remembers the name. The algorithm knows that. What was it called again?
Minority Report.
Minority Report. It's so good, and it's so sad that only one of us remembered the name. The algorithm isn't as good as in Minority Report. And I'm going to suggest that's endemic rather than a characteristic of the limited state of human knowledge. Okay, here's the other belongs here paper. Very recent work has shown that 90% of judges are really working poorly with private information they have. So we've talked about mugshot bias and we've talked about current offense bias. 90% of judges, if they hear about a case where someone was given bail and fled the jurisdiction, the next case, no bail. They are highly reactive to an individual case of error in that direction, and that is the availability heuristic again. But 10% of judges outperform the algorithm. There's 10% that will do better than the algorithm in judging flight risks. We don't know why. You could ask the algorithm why human beings do poorly, and it will tell you with some translation exercises. You ask the human judges why they do better than the algorithm, they probably won't know what you're talking about, and if they do, they won't tell you. The best hunch is that the 10% of judges are using private information that the algorithm doesn't have. They're seeing something in the local situation that the algorithm doesn't have access to. This is a profoundly Hayekian point about the limits of, let's say, planner information. The algorithm is like a planner, a really good one. But the judge will see something in the situation, maybe see goodness or trustworthiness in the defendant, or not, and the algorithm can't capture that. I am going to speculate that exactly the same is true of doctors, that the 10% best doctors will outperform the algorithm. I do this with fear and trembling because I don't have the data. We will know in the fullness of time. Okay, that's up the hill, pro-algorithm. Now let's go down the hill. And I'm going to give you 4 different contexts in which algorithms perform poorly, not worse than human beings. So this is no longer going to be a comparative exercise, but really poorly. And what I want to try to do, and this is going to have tentativeness in it, is to draw general lessons about the limitations of algorithms as prediction machines, with the weak version of the thesis being we're not nearly in a place where they can be good in these situations, and the strong version is it's built into the human condition that they can't get good. Okay, first of the 4 bits of data. There's a recent study involving predictions of life trajectories. And this was like a challenge to the world by a team of 112 researchers, a co-authored paper whose list of authors, if it hadn't been in small font, would have exceeded the length of the paper. Lots and lots of authors, 112 authors. How do they coordinate? That's a Hayekian problem. Okay, imagine this is the test. You have data on fragile families that's extremely rich. You have data about families at the age of 3, at the age of 5, at the age of 7, at the age of 9. You know a lot about them. Then the question is, what's going to happen to those families at the age of 15? Will they be suffering from some economic hardship? Will they be evicted? Will the kids show some quality that is measurable? And what the researchers did was they challenged the world to use machine learning to make predictions about what these families would be like a few years out. Got the setup? And the question on this is very recent, on which there was ground for optimism, which is what machine learning team would do really well at knowing where the 15-year-olds would be and their families. The algorithms, okay, there were 600 teams. This was spectacularly good groups of people using machine learning to try to make predictions. They were the best that humanity basically had, or really close to it. Of the 600 teams, here's one thing they could do pretty well, which is predict how the other teams would predict. The teams were good at predicting what the teams would predict, but they weren't good at all at predicting what the families would be like when the kids were 15. They were really not much better than random, a little better than random, but not much better than random. Very close to random. Think to yourself why that might be so. Let's look at the individual case. Suppose there's someone you know, there's someone I actually know who's 13. He's my son. It's going to get a little personal for a moment. Suppose I'm asked to predict how's he going to be or where's he going to be at age 18. Suppose a machine learning is asked to do that. Just the range of things that are ingredients in where he's going to be at the age of 18 is so high that the ability to foresee them is extremely limited. What teacher will inspire him? With whom will he fall in love? What topic will grab his attention? What will he see on television that turns his life around? Think, if you would, of where you are now, and ask yourself where you were, let's say, 15 years ago, or possibly 5 years ago, and the number of things that got you where you were is probably so large that identification of them, even in hindsight, is hazardous. Prediction of them in advance is just not doable. Maybe. That's example one. Can algorithms predict whether you're going to fall in love with a stranger? Can they help people to find romantic partners? So far, the results are really not promising. Samantha Joel and colleagues find that algorithms really struggle to predict the compatibility elements of human mating before two people meet, even if one has a huge number of self-report measures about traits and preferences that past researchers have identified as being relevant to romance. The upshot of the failure of algorithmic data in predicting whether people are going to connect, their upshot is that romantic attraction is less like a chemical reaction that we can predict than, and pause over this sentence if you would, quote, like an earthquake, such that the dynamic and chaos-like processes that cause its occurrence require considerable additional scientific inquiry before a prediction is realistic. I love the paper. I'm not sure what to make of that sentence. First, what is it that are dynamic and chaos-like processes in this context that make prediction unrealistic? And what is the additional scientific inquiry that would be needed that would make prediction realistic? Okay, the most modest version of the finding is that algorithms need a ton more data to meet accurate predictions, much more than is provided by self-report measures about traits and preferences. Maybe those bits of material just tell us too little. Maybe we need to focus on something else. An intuitive example, suppose you know that person A liked John and Tom and Ralph. She fell for them, but she had no interest in 3 other people with names. We might know that there are people who are like John and Tom and Ralph, and that would help us know she's going to fall for them. Maybe. I say that's better than what's been done so far, but we have no reason to think it's any good. There just isn't data that's supportive of my speculation. Okay, but take that speculation as compatible with the claim where algorithms are going to get much better. They're not good now. The more radical claim is that romantic attraction is like predicting a life trajectory. It depends on so many diverse factors and so many features of the context and the moment that algorithms can't do well in specifying the probability that Eric is going to fall for Paula. The reference to dynamic and chaos-like processes might be a shorthand way of capturing, e.g., location, weather, time of day, current mood, how things are going at work, that help explain and produce a sense of romantic connection or its absence. Jane might smile at a certain moment at lunch, and Eric's heart might flutter. Or Jane might not smile at that moment because she's distracted by something that happened in the morning. Is this resonating? Does this connect with personal experience? Eric might say something witty as sandwiches arise because of something he read in the paper that morning, and that might initiate a chain of events that culminates in marriage and children. So much depends on factors that can't be identified in advance. This is the sense in which algorithms are like central planners. They don't have relevant information about time and place. Okay, we do have to be careful here. For romance, it might be that there is something about person A or B that is just a deal breaker for Francesca. She just won't go for them. Maybe they are in the category of not her type, whereas others in the categories it might happen. And algorithms can maybe give us some progress on that. But can they do much better than that? We might speculate that the importance of concrete circumstances is such that there are real limits on their predictive power. Okay, I deal with the topic of romance not only because it's interesting in itself, but because it's a clue of broader limits of algorithms. So let's talk about revolution, shall we? In work that predated the work of algorithms, an economist named Timur Kuran urged a Hayek-inspired paper connected with what Mark Pennington described as the project of this series of events. Kuran urged that it's in the nature of revolutions that they can't be predicted. This is not possible. And he also urged that this is an advance of scientific knowledge to know what cannot be predicted. That's Kuran's claim. He contended that his thesis would be falsified, and then he laid out a challenge. If people could predict X or Y or Z in the coming years, and his thesis has not been falsified. I was in the White House during the time of the Arab Spring, and I can tell you the best intelligence analysts in the United States did not anticipate it happening at the time that it did. They anticipated there were issues, but what happened went whoosh, and who knew that it was going to go whoosh? Okay, Kuran identifies 3 problems, and my suggestion is that algorithms run into each of them. The first is it's really challenging to know what people's preferences are because we don't have access to what's inside their heads. So everyone in this room has at least one view on something that no one else in that person's life knows, or if anyone else in that person's life knows, it's 1 or 2, and your friends and colleagues, etc., just don't know that you think that. In a repressive society, and we're in the land of John Stuart Mill, so let's say in democracies too, this is a widespread phenomenon where people don't know what other people think, and it's not in principle knowable what other people think unless you can get inside their heads. And even if you know their Google searches and what they're saying on Twitter, you don't know what's inside their heads. Kuran urged that if we don't know what people's preferences are, we don't know whether they're willing to participate in a rebellion once the circumstances become propitious. Notice that even if we knew something about what's inside people's heads with respect to whether they want to be vegans in some sense, or they're willing to rebel against an authoritarian leader, they will have different thresholds for doing things, depending on what other people are doing, and getting access to people's thresholds is impossible. That's also inside their heads. Some people will go once there's a kind of permission slip from their peer group. Others will need a permission slip from multiple groups, not just their peer group. This isn't accessible. The third point is social interactions are essential. This is like romantic engagements writ large. What social interactions are crucial to knowing whether there's going to be a revolutionary movement. And these aren't knowable in advance. We don't know who's going to be talking to whom and saying what when, and with what consequence for the chaos-like process that might produce the Arab Spring or the fall of communism. Even if you could acquire data about what's inside people's heads and what people's thresholds are, you wouldn't have data about social interactions, which are what's happening on the ground. We might know when a revolution is improbable in the extreme, and we might know when it's at least possible, but it's very hard to be able to get more clarity than that. Okay, we've talked about life trajectories, romance, and revolutions. I'm going to end this part of remarks by talking about the success of cultural products. And this is also work that predated algorithms, but it's devastating to the claim that ex-ante prediction is possible in certain contexts. Okay, so here's the starting point of the research, which has been replicated in surprising contexts from Matthew Salganik and team. The question is, how do we know whether a song is going to be a spectacular breakout or whether it's going to crash? To find out, Salganik and team created an artificial music market, let's call it the Music Lab, with a bunch of real songs by real groups. One song, pleasingly, is called I Am Error, relevant to our topic today. Another is called Trapped in an Orange Peel. That's unlikely to be a successful song, is it? Wasn't it? Does that even mean? But it has a kind of science fictional quality that is suitable for these purposes. Another is called Separation Anxiety. Half of the group is sorted into an independent judgment condition. And that's, imagine you all are sorted into a group where you can hear I Am Error, you can hear Separation Anxiety, you can hear Trapped in an Orange Peel, and you can download it if you like. And then we get an ordering from this group of what songs are best. And let's call that a merits ordering, in the sense that you're just saying what you like. Okay, here's where the study gets fiendish. Members of the large segment of humanity that visits this website are sorted into 8 groups in which they can see how many songs are being downloaded within their group. So imagine you're sorted into a group of thousands, but you can see whether Trapped in an Orange Peel is getting a lot of early support or whether Separation Anxiety is the winner. You can see it in real time. Now this is the world, isn't it? We can see in real time what's getting support frequently. The question is whether ultimately Trapped in an Orange Peel would, forgive me if any of you wrote or sang on Trapped in an Orange Peel. Is any of you the singer, the lead singer on Trapped? Okay, so Trapped in an Orange Peel, a terrible song. It's going to flop, and I Am Error, which for a behavioral scientist is a pleasing title, that's going to do really well. And that's how it's always going to work out. That merit's going to win out, and the terribleness is going to lose. But that's not what happened. That in the 8 subgroups, Trapped in an Orange Peel could be a major hit or a miserable flop, depending on whether a lot of other people initially downloaded it and were seen to have done so. Almost anything could happen. Almost any song could end up popular or not, depending on whether or not it was the beneficiary of initial downloads. Got it? This works, by the way, for products and for political positions. It's been replicated in the context of what do you think about nanotechnology, or do you think this is a cute animal? It's replicated. The songs that did the very best in the independent judgment group rarely completely tanked, and the songs that did the very worst rarely did spectacularly well, but otherwise anything could happen. Can you see the kind of thrilling and horrifying upshot of this? It's that in advance, success and failure are not predictable, whether we're speaking of algorithms or human beings making the predictions. The reason is it's not possible to know whether a cultural product will benefit from the equivalent of early downloads. And the reason we know it's not possible to know that is this is randomized. This is 8 independent worlds. Different things happened in them. You might be able to know that Taylor Swift is going to do great. I hope so. She's fantastic. But I also believe that the deep truth is that she's ultimately a beneficiary of chaos-like processes that vaulted her to the top, which is not to take anything away, Ms. Swift, who I believe is watching right now, from your amazingness, but which is also to say what I believe you know to be true, which is the role of serendipity and surprise. Okay, we're just about done. The first claim is that in many domains, algorithms outperform human beings because they eliminate noise and reduce or eliminate bias. As current offense bias and mugshot bias show, experienced judges here in the literal sense do a lot worse than algorithms. The same is true of current symptom bias and demographic bias. What's noteworthy is that the 4 biases named here did not even have names in advance of the algorithmic research. Algorithms can help not only to counteract human biases, but also to identify them. Okay, with trepidation, here is a first crack at the 5 situations in which algorithms will do poorly. The reason is an absence of adequate data, and the upshot is the intrinsic unpredictability of human affairs. First, algorithms might not be able to foresee the effects of social interactions, which can lead in all sorts of unanticipated directions, from revolutions to life trajectories to romance to music. Second, algorithms might not be able to foresee the effects of context, timing, serendipity, or mood. Third, the most Hayekian on the list of 5, algorithms might lack local knowledge about relevant particulars or knowledge about what's currently happening or likely to happen on the ground. Remember the 10% of judges who beat the algorithms. Fourth, algorithms might struggle to identify people's preferences, which might be concealed or falsified, and which might be revealed at an unexpected time, maybe because of some sort of social permission slip, which is itself really hard to anticipate. Fifth, algorithms might struggle to anticipate sudden shocks or breakthroughs, a pandemic, a technological discovery, or a successful terrorist attack, with a suggestion that the black swan problem, as it's sometimes called, is fundamental and best understood as a problem of inadequate sample sizes. That's what it's a problem of. Even if we have huge data, we don't have enough. Okay, in some cases, the private knowledge case is one, people should be able to do better than algorithms can do. But the real problem is the relevant data are not available to anyone, which means that accurate predictions are not possible. In a way, that is discouraging, isn't it? But it is also maybe inspiring, a tribute to the role of luck, coincidence, and surprise in human affairs, and also to the inevitability, hat tip to Anais Nin, of mystery and wonder, which we might be to explain after the fact, but not before. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Cass, for that absolutely fantastic presentation. Certainly a lot of food for thought for me and hopefully for you. So we've now got time for some questions. So please raise your hand. And we have got some mics, I think, going around. So can we take the gentleman on the front row?
Thank you very much for your talk and for being here today. I'm interested in politics, algorithms, and what happens when the two converge. So my question is, in democracies, by the end of this century, is it plausible that big data will gradually reduce politics to mechanics where algorithms are God and voters are mere ones and zeros? And would this then allow political candidates to circumvent the whole process of basic persuasion, whereby they stop looking to persuade people with ideas and arguments and instead look to identify the people most likely to vote for them and exclude everyone else? Be your thoughts.
That's great. Okay, so can I tell you a true story? There was a political candidate in the recent past, his last name might have been Obama, who was running for re-elect, and I saw some of the ads that were going out, and because I do behavioral science, I worried that they weren't good, and I'm a fan of President Obama, and I talked to the campaign team and said, this probably isn't a good ad. It's not behaviorally attuned. It's not informed by what we know. And the person looked at me and said, we've tested it. We know it works. It's right. They used, what was then not as fancy as now to figure out what works. And that's what campaigns are using. Now, I think the idea that with algorithms, you'd stop using ideas and arguments and just appeal to the people who like you, that's probably not a winning strategy. And just unless you're really likable. So there are a lot of people like you. So if you have a political candidate in a democracy who just goes big on the people who are predisposed toward that person, unless there's something unusual in the situation, that person's going to lose. So what you need to do is to win over the people who are skeptical or uncertain. And what algorithms can help you do is know something about what's likely to work. And is this worrisome? I think the answer isn't no. But it's complicated because the algorithm should show you there's a group of people who don't know whether they like you, who are very concerned about climate change. Better win them over. How do you win them over? Well, you better start talking about climate change. Is that a terrible thing, or is that like a 3.0 of what we've always had? What I worry about for algorithms and politics and commerce is if algorithms know that certain people lack information or are subject to certain behavioral biases, then they can exploit lack of knowledge or behavioral biases. And that's very bad. And Mark and I also discussed the worry that algorithms can create echo chambers in which people are getting more and more excited about, let's say, a false bit of information, or can get more enthusiastic about a point of view that really ought to be interrogated rather than just shouted over and over again. And so the misinformation problem seems fundamental. Hashtag duh, D-U-H, but I'll say it anyway. Is that too informal for supposedly a professor? Hashtag duh. Has anyone from this lectern ever said hashtag duh? Did Hayek himself say the equivalent of, I like to think he did. It was funnier and wittier by him, but he said something similar. Okay, he was a serious guy, Hayek. But it's obvious, of course, that the use of algorithms to spread misinformation is a clear and present danger. The idea of crowding out ideas and information, less clear, because ideas and information are often the currency that voters need to hear attended to.
Thank you, and thank you for that presentation. It was full of really thought-provoking examples. My concerns these days are a little bit about these moments, not when the algorithms disagree with human prediction, but when they overlap too much. And I'm thinking a little bit about, this book is now a little bit old, but it was a provocative and important argument, even though it has a very unlovely title, Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill. And so she's a data scientist who has written this book that shows the ways in which algorithmic governance can actually reproduce systemic forms of bias, especially racism and other forms of structural inequality, even when that is not coded in the data. And so what her work, so this is published in 2016, and what her work shows is that, some of this, it's not because there's the data is specifically, referring explicitly to race or socioeconomic status or any of these other things, but she's looking at things like, mortgage lending, policing, and the use of algorithms in those kinds of domains, where what she finds is that, data is not a neutral thing, right? So that the data that we feed into the system comes, in these complicated ways that have already been filtered through many, many layers of, human discernment, because actually all data is like that. And so what ends up happening is that the algorithms encourage over-policing in certain neighborhoods, not because they know that it is, a Black or ethnic minority neighborhood, but because there's so much data, because those are already over-policed areas, they pick up more incidents, and those incidents then drive, further investigations in an area that has much less policing. Lots of things might be happening that are simply, that don't appear in the data. So that I want to kind of, think a little bit about what happens, not when these disagree with our predictions, but actually reinforce our own forms of systemic bias.
Okay, it's a great question. If everyone heard it, it's about algorithms replicating, let's say, racism or sexism, because the data that's being used encodes that, even if it isn't specifically based on race or sex. So let's sneak up on it, shall we? So I'd like to know whether in the doctors and heart attack data, there's anything involving race or sex that's aggravated by the use of algorithms or that's improved. So this is knowable and unclear what the answer is. One thing that's clear is a lot of people aren't being tested who've used the algorithm, who shouldn't be tested, and a lot of people are being helped in their health who wouldn't otherwise be helped in their health. And it's imaginable, and I'll talk a little bit more why this isn't completely speculative, that this has disproportionate benefits for people of color and women. It might not, but it's imaginable. To vindicate the intuition, the jail one, a lot of people of color, if you use the algorithm, aren't going to be in jail anymore, because the algorithm will say they're not a flight risk, let them out. And because the disproportionate, just in numbers, of people who are in jail are people of color, an algorithm that's more accurate lets people out, it's going to be letting a lot of people of color out, more than white people. That's great. Now, if you use the algorithm, which is more accurate, do you switch the jail population in the direction of white, away from people of color? Not really. It's about the same. So it does well along the axis of less fleeing, less people in jail, fewer people in jail. It doesn't change the percentage, which is high for people of color. Could you do that? Yeah, tell it to. Tell the algorithm. Make it so that there are fewer people of color in jail. It can do that. And it can do that significantly without decreasing the level of fleeing and the level of crime. It can just make it better. So the universe of algorithms that can make things better along the dimension of structural inequality is extremely large. And the universe of algorithms which should be better than people because they don't explicitly think about race, you won't have implicit racial bias or implicit gender bias for an algorithm. So even if there are decision makers, let's say, who are abhor racism, but who behave in a racially inflected way, the algorithm won't do that because it doesn't have unconscious bias. So that's a positive. Still, your point does hold in contexts where the underlying data reflects something. It might be inequality or it might be discrimination. So if it's the case that, for example, people of color are arrested more than white people, then if you used arrest rates as predictive of something, the algorithm is trained to make a little weeing noise when any of us is getting into politically provocative territory. It's kind of a warning. So for you and me, that's the weeing noise. But we're going to ignore the weeing noise. We're going to override the algorithm and say that, yes, if there's discrimination encoded in the data, that's a big problem. Does it mean that the algorithm is worse than people, even if it encodes discrimination? That's not clear. Maybe. Does it mean that, Houston, we have a problem? Absolutely. So we shouldn't rely on the data that encodes discrimination, or we should correct it, meaning program the algorithm, train the algorithm on data unpolluted by discriminatory practices.
Thank you for your presentation. To pick up on the point where you mentioned it's difficult to predict, so I would love to take the direction towards speculation. So for example, we generally are control human beings, we want to control things. So what if I could know what are the possibilities in the future which are going to happen and manipulate those possible predictions and a little bit influence something? So how would you put this thing into pro and con of the algorithm? Or how do you see this thing to control and see what potentials are there and then influence those predictions?
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about when algorithms do well and why, and see if we can use that to undermine my skeptical second half. Okay. If you tell me, suppose I give you a bunch of jokes, 7, and you rank them on a scale of 1 to 10 and how funny they are, an algorithm will be excellent at knowing what jokes you will find funny. Really, really good. In fact, there's data suggesting an algorithm will know better what jokes you will find funny than the person who knows you best in the world will do in knowing what jokes you find funny. That's kind of funny, but it's true. Nonetheless, people don't like these algorithms and don't trust them that tell them what they think they will find funny. They don't believe them. Except if people are given the mechanism that I just explained. Once they're told this is why, that the data is trained on zillions of people who know what people who find jokes 1 and 2 funny and 7 and 8 unfunny also find funny. Then people start to say, oh, no wonder it does well. It has a ton of data. It kind of knows what I find funny because it knows what people like me find funny. Okay, so what I'm thinking is whether that is undermining some of my negative claims, that with respect to certain things, maybe we use that strategy rather than the strategy of taking input characteristics. And would this work for music? Probably not. Would it work for revolutions? No. Would it work for life trajectories? Not at all. Would it work for romantic attraction? Maybe. So to your point, going back over success and failure might allow learning. But the strong version of the claim, which we might know relatively soon whether it's right, is it's in the nature of human affairs that certain things are not predictable in advance. Okay, I'll tell you a story that I think that I hadn't thought of till your question. I was part of the Defense Department's Defense Innovation Board a few years ago, which had Silicon Valley people and me. And I thought, we need to make friends. I've never been to Silicon Valley, I don't think, so I need to make friends. So I said, this shows a failure of prediction on my part. I said to one of my Silicon Valley colleagues, I said, cost-benefit analysis is so important. If we want to figure out what innovation to do, we have to really try to figure out the costs and benefits of our efforts. And he looked at me like I was from Mars and said, oh, in Silicon Valley, we don't do cost-benefit analysis. And you couldn't have surprised me more when he said that. These are extremely profitable companies. They don't do cost-benefit analysis. And he said, no, we don't do that. And I said, what do you do? And he said, we test. I said, what do you mean you test? He said, we have an innovation. We test it. Does it work? Do people like it? We use small scale. We monitor in real time. We don't do ex-ante cost-benefit analysis. We do on-the-ground monitoring. And if a product starts taking off, we have reason to think we should scale it up. If people hate it or it doesn't work, forget it. So that idea of testing is more promising than ex-ante algorithmic prediction.
It's fascinating talk. Thank you. What you just said just made me think about Silicon Valley Bank. Maybe they should have done more cost-benefit analysis. Anyway, particularly with regard to the limitations of algorithms that you have identified, is there, or do you foresee in the future, any potential solution to some of those and other problems because of algorithms that are either sort of self-evaluative or algorithms that design other algorithms in a sort of hurdles all the way down manner?
Okay, good. Okay, so one possibility is that it's all of the problems identified are data limitations, and these can be overcome. So you might know, if you have enough data, that these songs are going to do poorly, these songs are going to do well. I think that's not true because the social interactions can't be predicted. You might be able to assign probabilities. So this is something I've learned from Kahneman. When asked, is X going to happen, assign probabilities, that's just liberating rather than saying yes or no. Say 55% likely, that might be also just a guess, but maybe it's informed. And if you know your own level of certainty is 55% rather than 90. So I'm thinking algorithms might be able to learn that the probability that something will happen is over 50% and under 70. Now, what does that even mean? I think that's a fair question. What does that mean even? So there's a view that for one-shot events, the idea of probability judgments is a confusing idea. We know if you flip a coin 100 times, it's going to come up heads 50% of the time. Do we know that it's probable that a new record by Selena Gomez will sell at least a certain number of, like 50 votes? It's not clear what that sentence means exactly. But bracketing that, they might learn probabilities. I could tell from some of the expressions on your faces, which I was monitoring very closely, that when I was talking about Curran's claims about revolutions, some of you were thinking, we know more about people's preferences now than we did in the 1990s. So you can learn from Google searches what people are really focusing on, much better than ever. And you can learn from what's happening on Facebook if people are very unhappy with the regime. So there's a book called Everybody Lies about Google searches. It's like 1.0 of showing that what you think people think isn't true. And Google searches show that. And this is exploitable by predictors. Here's something that suggests a little more optimism. It's kind of backing into it for algorithms being able to learn more. It doesn't involve algorithms, but there's a paper a few years ago by an English-speaking political scientist who got the cooperation of the Chinese government on how China responds to things that are happening on its Twitter. And the basic finding was, if people are saying negative things about the Chinese government on their social media, the government doesn't censor it. There's a, to many people, surprisingly low level of censorship. They flood the system with positive comments, thinking that's the right remedy. But if someone says, let's meet on this street at a specific time at night, on a specific day, that's taken down. Now that's, whatever you think of the, anything about the example, it shows some understanding of what's dangerous. Because if there's an event happening on the street at a certain time, then there are social interactions, then things might get very concerning. And maybe algorithms can do much better than that.
Thank you, and a big thank you very much for coming and speaking. Really enjoyed it. My question was kind of related to what you were just saying there. Do you think then, given your hypothesis that the sort of emergence out of social chaos makes something unpredictable with algorithms, does it make algorithms potentially more, or in authoritarian countries, are people more susceptible to potentially being controlled through predictive algorithms? And then the reverse of that, does the proliferation of algorithms potentially encourage or facilitate the development of authoritarianism?
These are great questions. So, cards on the table. I feel clear that across large populations, algorithms can do better with prediction problems than human beings in a way that can lead to large social gains. And also help us identify biases. Murkier, but through a glass darkly, is that there's a set of social problems that algorithms are currently very challenged to solve, and maybe will never be able to solve. And maybe some of you in this room can do much better than I've been able to do on that category. It's a really important category. On whether authoritarian governments will be able to use algorithms to create more self-entrenchment than now. As Zhou Enlai said about the French Revolution, it's too soon to tell. Probably of the various instruments that authoritarian governments have to entrench themselves, I think it would be a science fiction tale, though this may be wrong, to think algorithms are the best, are fantastic. It's more like threats. But I may be thinking of Orwell's 1984, and you're thinking about Huxley's Brave New World. And it may be that the Brave New World is more prescient. So I'm thinking, what would it look like? So here's something to worry about, and I maybe have a co-authored alleged paper on this, which is that algorithms can create harm to consumers if they are aware that people suffer from behavioral biases. So if an algorithm knows that you love books about behavioral economics, it will, does this seem like a completely hypothetical and non-autobiographical example? It will tell you about a lot of behavioral economics books. And that's great. That's not a problem. But if an algorithm knows that you suffer from a self-control problem and are an impulsive purchaser of books about the Beatles, then it can flood you with books about the Beatles to your detriment. And so there is a consumer protection challenge from the fact that algorithms can know what you don't know, probably, and also know what your biases are and exploit them. So I think that's a manageable problem to identify and possibly even to handle. But your question suggests, well, what about governments? What if authoritarian governments know? Is this so speculative? What people's lack of information is? That's not speculative in the least. Or what if they know what people's behavioral biases are? That's a serious risk to to freedom. We're not even talking about democracy. So this is a dystopian tale. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for an engaging talk. I've worked with behaviour change about 13 years, trying to get kids and parents to walk and cycle to school, and further, don't do it now, but I'm much more interested in the progress of this subject. There's one thing, it's about songs, and if I can get this question open and find it out. When you've got feedback, how important is it? You draw like the voters, or let's just call them voters for the songs, who's going to like them. That's on a continuous feedback loop. So they'll see somebody votes, and then and it'll grow, or however. I've sort of presented it. When you're planning with either a bucket of data that gets thrown at you at the beginning, like the judges or whatever, compared to being continuously sprinkled with a watering can, with maybe have the flies in it that come out at some point, which fly comes out when, and so on. How does the progress and the time delivery of information affect people's decision making and the predictions? I hope that makes some degree of sense. And where the feedback, or don't get feedback, and when the feedback happens, both with humans and with algorithms.
Okay, so suppose an algorithm's trying to predict whether someone with certain symptoms has lung cancer. The algorithm just sees 7 things about the person and then says test or no test. There isn't feedback in a relevant way, and there isn't need for it. It might be that there'd be a continuous situation in which the person is tested for one thing, and then the algorithm is told to update given that finding, and then you get more honed in on lung cancer or not. I think the distinction you're drawing is that for the success of a book or a song or a movie, it's not like that there's continuous feedback in real time. So my understanding is for songs, that the ability of the industry to predict success or failure is extremely limited. That Taylor Swift is going to do well, but it's extremely limited. But they can tell in the first 2 weeks whether something is breaking out or not. And there's very careful monitoring of what's happening in the first 2 weeks. And there are actually locations that are predictive of whether something's going to do spectacularly worldwide. Is that based on an algorithm now? I don't know. It is based on large data. But if an algorithm is monitoring feedback effects, it should be able to at least see the probability this is going to bust out. So to know in advance whether I am error is going to do great is, I say, in the nature of the thing, impossible. But if you see in the first week that I am error is getting a lot of downloads, then bet on it. Bet on that one. And that's what the industry is increasingly doing. And algorithms are surely assisting in that.
I was just thinking that if the people who are voting don't know who else has voted for it, the record company knows, but surely the people who are voting are influenced by the people who are voting.
Yes, well, in the real world, whether we hear a song depends on whether other people have supported it. Here's a vivid example. Star Wars was believed by the studio to be doomed. The actors thought it was going to be a complete failure. The people who saw it, who were like movie specialists, who saw the early version, thought this is terrible and felt very awkward about it. The only one who liked it was Steven Spielberg, said this is the best movie ever, and he wasn't Steven Spielberg yet. And yet Star Wars, whoa. On one view, Star Wars was just so great that it was bound to break out. But then how could the studio have been so clueless? Even George Lucas thought it wasn't going to do very well. It was just as you described. It was people were seeing in real time, not with fine-grained data, but with, bright colors. Everyone's going to see Star Wars. And then it became like an early download success in the Music Lab experiment.
Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I have a simple question about the way how you think about preferences, because it seems that the way how you think about them is that they are somewhere in our heads, and sometimes the problem might be that they're simply inaccessible to an observer from the outside, or they might be dispersed, so it's difficult to aggregate them. But on the Hayekian note, is there a possibility that these preferences are not in fact data, that they're not given, and that preferences in themselves in fact emerge from those interactions? And that could be true about political competition or competition in markets, and that would lead to your sort of idiosyncratic, non-ergodic conclusions that you mentioned that algorithms might not be able to deal with.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So you're completely right that I was assuming that preferences are in heads and that it's hard to have access to them, and that social movements are often, think of Black Lives Matter, a result of giving people a permission slip. And then it's learned that this is in a lot of people's heads. But you're right that preferences might be unformed, or even if formed, they might be endogenous to things. So people might think, okay, so there was one person after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe said with bafflement, a year ago, everybody liked communism. Now no one likes communism. How'd that happen? Now, it might be that originally no one liked communism and they were free to say so, finally. But the idea that no one liked communism before the revolution, that would be surprising. And so a lot of people changed their view. So think of your favorite things, favorite examples: Brexit, vegetarianism, sex equality. A lot of it is, or consumer products. A cell phone without a tactile, like the old BlackBerry. I hated the iPhone. Now I love the iPhone. That tactile thing's a waste, but that's just what you say. It's changing preferences. So that you're making a great point that I wish I had made and will steal, which is when preferences are endogenous to things, then it will be very hard for an algorithm to predict.
Testing, much better. Right. So I have two questions. So the first question: with the rise of blockchain-based financial services, where we'll have central bank digital currencies, are there any foreseeable downsides to having programmable money, which is money with inbuilt rules, which will constrain the user's ability to use it?
That's two questions.
That's one question. And the second question is, with the advance in quantum computing, whereby governments will have the ability and the data and computing power to create very detailed, simulated realities, are there any dangers to that? And also, as society becomes more susceptible to intentional and manipulative design, who will oversee that process?
Okay, great. Those are fantastic questions. I think we need general recognition of a right not to be manipulated, that in the early part of the 20th century, a right to privacy was created kind of by people who saw the threats, and the idea of privacy, which a right to privacy didn't really exist in earlier, I mean in some forms, but it was a combination of various forms of rights violations that got a umbrella. And so we need a right not to be manipulated, which should run both against governments and against the private sector. And exactly how to specify that, that's a challenge of the first order, isn't it? It's a little like fraud and deception, but it's not the same. That you might be manipulated without being lied to. And then the question is, how do we build up tools against it? So here's a general idea that many of the rights that are regarded as sacred emerged from the lived reality of wrongs. And so that they didn't come out of Kant. They came out of cruelty or harm. And I think that you're putting your finger on one. We don't have it against governments, do we? And we don't have it against commercial actors. We need that. On simulations and quantum computing, the reason I asked you is that I don't have a good answer to the first one at all. And I fear I don't have a good answer to the second one. When I hear simulations, I think of something quite closely related to what we're discussing, which is the challenge of making ex-ante projections of what will happen and having scenarios analyzed instead. So you might think of this in the national security domain. With what probability is a specified thing going to happen? Extremely unclear, more than 5%, less than 90%. That's not that great. But what's the scenario under which? Now, if quantum computing helps us get clarity on what happens if, take your pick, that's at least good for the relevant nation, and whether it's good for humanity depends on whether, et cetera. On blockchain and program money, I don't know enough. So I thank you and plead ignorance. What's the last sentence of Wittgenstein's Tractatus? I say what he said.
Thank you very much for a wonderful discussion. You'll have to excuse me. This discipline is one I'm not in any way accustomed to, so it was a revelation to listen to. Now, it struck me, and correct me if I'm wrong here, what struck me was listening to your discussion of principles of Hayek. To me, it sounded almost like Newtonian determinism. And when you were discussing limitations of algorithms, it almost sounded to me like intrinsic unknowns, sounded to me almost quantum in its sense. To that extent, has there been an attempt to represent an uncertainty principle by way of the product of two unknown variables?
That's great and extremely interesting. And there was a time when I was extremely focused on Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle. So I'd like to go back to it. I'm thinking that John Rawls had a footnote, the American philosopher, in a manuscript he never published. The footnote said, "We post a signpost, : no deep thinking here. Things are bad enough already." But maybe we need some deep thinking.
So I was wondering a little bit on one of the points that you may arise for algorithms, or even just people's, society's judgment. And that is, if in the future the use of algorithms increases, as well as the use of, for example, government nudges, which is kind of where my question derives from. And forgive my ignorance, because I am in first year and I've not studied too much of psychology yet, but I find it quite interesting how more consciousness about how algorithms and government nudges are used, how that may influence human behavior in itself. I'm not sure if my question makes sense.
Completely. Okay, so let's talk about nudges, shall we? It's in my contract that if I don't talk about nudges, I get fired. Okay, so some nudges are educative, like a calorie label or a fuel economy label or something that says this has shrimps and peanuts in it. So they give you information. An energy efficiency label is a nudge, which tells you something to help you make better choices. And some nudges are architectural, like if you're automatically enrolled in a certain plan, or if your printer is double-sided by default, or if your grocery store is arranged so the healthy foods are the first ones you see and the less healthy ones are toward the back. So there are architectural nudges. Governments should be subjected to something like a Bill of Rights or a set of ethical constraints on nudges, and we can figure out what they might be. They might have to be transparent rather than covert. Educative ones just are. They might have to be consistent with the interests and values of the people on whom they're imposed. We might want something like that also for companies. So, do you know the term dark patterns? It's about things like automatically enrolling you in some insurance scheme where you pay money because you bought a pen and you might lose the pen. It's a good pen. And for only $2 a month, you can get insured. So if I can replace, is that not a good deal? I can replace this pen that's a terrible deal. That's a dark pattern. I, by the way, bought an iPhone recently and I was really rushing. And the iPhone guy said, we have this insurance for you. And I said, yeah, sounds great. And so it was such a terrible long time in the store that I bought the insurance. And then I thought, this is kind of what I do. I work on this stuff. That's a terrible idea. So I said to him, no, I don't want the insurance. And he said, well, it's too late now, but you can get rid of the insurance. You just call and say you don't want it anymore. Yeah, right. Canceling that insurance is not possible. And also, they keep sending me things about more charges they're imposing on me because of the insurance. Now, that's a dark pattern. You can think of it as a bad nudge. It's not in the interest of persons. And you're raising the intriguing question there's some writing about, which is algorithms can design nudges that are really helpful for people. It can save their lives by telling people in certain situations, this is a risk you're facing and this is how to reduce it. Or they can be horrible and self-interested.
Okay, everybody, I think it's time for everybody's slippers. I'd just like to say thank you to you all for coming along this evening to the event. If you're interested in these themes, we have an event on Thursday of this week with Professor Diane Coyle from University of Cambridge. She's going to be speaking about problems of big data, which actually overlaps with some of the themes that Cass has been speaking about. But really, I'd just like to conclude by saying thank you to you all for coming. But most of all, please give a very, very generous hand of applause to our amazing speaker, Cass Sunstein.
Thank you.